Hello, Digital Founders. What would have DF looked like in the 90s with the rise of home computers for gaming? Kind of happened in the 80s, that one, I think.
Hmm.
The first the quote unquote first 3D games and the beginnings of the interwebs. I suppose I'm best
Amazing.
suited to answer that. But Alex, you were about in the 90s gaming.
I was.
So
I was.
you
There were capture cards back then to a somewhat degree. You could like plug things in and get like a TV signal on your computer. That was a thing. I'm pretty sure you could probably record them. I just don't like the size of the files. There were not great compression codecs back then. Where would you upload these videos to? What would this all be about? What would even DF do? Would it be a magazine article? Rich?
Yes, it would be. But
Mm-hmm.
first, Oliver, thoughts on a kind of 90s DF? Do you think it would have been interesting?
Well, I wasn't really gaming too much in the 90s, but I was certainly gaming in the early 2000s. And I remember, picking up my magazines, my OXM, my PC Gamer and whatnot. And those all came with pack-in discs for the most part, or at least very often they'd come with pack-in discs. So I would think that if you're doing DF in the 90s, that it would probably be a magazine with high DPI images scattered throughout, certainly beyond the capabilities of most 56K modems to display at a reasonable period of time. And
Yeah.
you'd combine text and images, and then maybe you'd also have some pack-in discs with some, low bitrate video on a CD. I'd expect that would probably be the situation, and some images, I imagine, as well. I think that'd probably be how it would go. I don't know.
That's an interesting point because obviously I was there in the 90s
Yeah.
and I was aware of the technology that we use for doing magazines because I was using magazines. So how do we begin here? I think first of all, you talk about concept wise, a lot of what we do works because there's a sharing attitude between game developers that just wasn't there in the 90s. You had forums like SIGGRAPH and GDC coming into the fore kind of like in the 2000s. And there was a much more sort of wider sharing of information, whereas in the 90s, everything was a lot more closed. And you kind of saw occasional things happening in the Amiga space, I guess. The UK Games Press did speak to developers. That was quite interesting. It was only really when Edge came about in Edge magazine by Future Publishing, I think that was like 94, 95, where you actually had a stronger focus on developers. But even then, they weren't really talking that much about graphics technology. So a lot of what we do at Digital Foundry is informed by the fact that there is this disclosure about how things work in gaming these days, which is, instrumental in producing Digital Foundry. So a DF from the 90s would have necessarily been quite different. Frame rate analysis just would never have happened. I guess in the 90s there were capture cards. We used them. We used, I think, first of all in 90, I'm thinking 1994 for some reason. That would make sense. But they didn't capture full frame rate. So you could have had full resolution, but you would have not had full frame rate. So you wouldn't have been able to do frame rate analysis. It would have been eyeballed. There weren't high-speed cameras. I suppose you could point a camcorder at the screen, but that would be problematic as well. So yeah, I mean, it would have been more of a conceptual thing about what's happening. What does this new hardware do? Pressing for interviews with the creators of the hardware, talking to developers, trying to get them to open up a bit more about the technical side of things, which I guess nobody really even tried until like Edge started.
Right.
There was still this sort of subjective view, particularly when Super NES came about, of slowdown, quote unquote slowdown, where games were just literally slowing down. You'd have a frame rate drop, but it would actually be tied to the speed of the game,
Yeah.
which happened quite a lot on SNES titles. It would have
It
been a
did.
nice way to quantify that, but you wouldn't have been able to do it with the technology of the time. I think the other thing is when you're in the 16-bit era, the amount of titles where you could have talked in DF terms would have been quite sparing. I mean, there was some great stuff, obviously, but looking back retrospectively, you're looking at an entire console era and picking out individual titles, as opposed to doing it on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis as we do these days. So it would have been a very different thing, but very interesting when a properly epoch-making game came along, like, Wolfenstein 3D or Doom. When Doom came along, it was kind of like, wow, this is just incredible. But I guess there wasn't really that much of an attempt by the press to dig deep into why it was so amazing. It kind of just was. You were looking more to the sort of dot plan stuff that Carmack and Sweeney were doing at the time there. What do you think about that, Alex, specifically? I guess once we move into the PC era of the graphics accelerator, which is kind of like then something more recognizably DF could have been done.
Yes. I think at that point in time, that's when you started seeing real comparisons about frame rates in games, usually using time demos. So it was usually at that point in time, up until Fraps came about, it was all relying on whatever a game could allow you to measure using it. Or you'd have like marks, like system benchmarks that you can install via DOS that would give you like a mark score for certain things. I think that's when you could start doing it a lot more. And I think that would have been a really interesting era for DF like footage or like analysis to come about, because nowadays, I think one thing that when you go back in time and look at any older, specifically graphics accelerator reviews, they're comparing things where like they're doing like totally like CPU limited stuff at times and they're not realizing it. They're doing GPU limited stuff at the time and they're like, all these processors are the same. And like nowadays we get the idea. We know that these things are very different. And we like that insight at the time would have given like, I think a much better consumer experience. People would have realized that they don't need some X graphics accelerator, or maybe they do, especially in the graphics accelerator wars when the 3DFX Voodoo and Voodoo 2 would actually offer the game so it looks like a game. And then you'd have your, other weirdo random DX6 capable graphics accelerator having a game that has 3D polygons in it, but it's missing all the lighting. It's missing everything. Like these things were not great. There was not a lot of consumer information back then. And I think that stuff could have really helped.
Yeah, that would have been like, the classic example, I got the rendition Verite GPU to play Quake at high resolution or high frame rate hardware accelerating. Then of course Carmack blew it all out of the water with his support for OpenGL for the Voodoo cards, which was just quantifiably better. But how do you quantify it? That would have been quite interesting I guess there was stuff happening at that time that would have made that possible.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I've just been thinking, in 1999 we had a frame grabber specifically for Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and that actually buffered the last 5 seconds of gameplay, which possibly maybe it could have buffered more frames and at a higher frame rate. The idea that we used for buffering then was basically if you were playing a game through a frame grabber and you saw something great happen, you didn't have to suddenly press the capture button to get that moment because you wouldn't get it. So the idea was that you could pause, go back through your buffer and choose that precise shot that actually made a game look great, that tried to capture that experience in a static image. So maybe that would have been, if we were thinking about frame rate analysis. Frame rate analysis happened in 2008, I think, where I was capturing HDMI raw at 720p 60, and it was like, well, hold on a minute, why don't we count the frames in any given second? And then you had an frame rate analysis, and then you plotted it over a graph. Those graphs were initially like transparent TIFF files in a massive sequence that you overlaid.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it was a nightmare. It was all DOS level command prompts. It was not great. But yeah, that's a really interesting topic. It might actually be quite fun one day to actually produce a 90s DF.
Oh my gosh. Well, I would love to try and do it, because sometimes I look at I watch a lot of Lazy Game Reviews, LGR, and he's had a lot of oddware there, and some of it actually has to do with seeing other images from other PCs on your PC and things like that. And I think it's totally possible. I love it when people try and use retro hardware to produce modern videos, and I think it could be amazing.
Yeah, you'd also have to ask developers to role play their 90s selves.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
Yeah.